Why are North Korea's leaders specifically threatening U.S. bombers? In response to Trump, Ri Yong-ho threatened to shoot down strategic bombers, showing fear of U.S. bombardment and a potential for wider conflict. After weeks of tension over North Korea's pursuit of a nuclear capability, the latest verbal exchanges between Washington and Pyongyang evoke a time, more than 6 decades ago, when the regime was at the mercy of conventional weapons. Every North Korean schoolchild is taught, erroneously, that the U.S. started the Korean War. But they also learn, correctly, that the nemesis was responsible for laying waste to dozens of towns and cities from the air during the 1950-53 conflict, a fact rarely reported in the U.S. media at the time. The carpet bombing of North Korea has been all but forgotten in the U.S., but not in North Korea, where the regime exploits every opportunity to remind its people, in schools and museums, and via the state media, that the U.S. is still the aggressor. Donald Trump reinforced that narrative this week when, having heard the North's foreign minister, Ri Yong-ho, make a highly provocative speech at the UN General Assembly. He tweeted, "If he echoes thoughts of Little Rocket Man, they won't be around much longer." Ri said Trump's words amounted to a declaration of war, before piling more pressure on the U.S. president. "Since the United States declared war on our country, we will have every right to make countermeasures, including the right to shoot down United States strategic bombers even when they are not inside the airspace border of our country," he said. It is not the first time the North has accused the U.S. and its allies of declaring war. In fact, given that the Korean War ended with an armistice, but not a peace treaty, the two countries have been technically at war for the past 64 years. In 2013, North Korea said it and South Korea were in a state of war, following international condemnation of its nuclear test. 3 years later, it said U.S. sanctions targeting Kim Jong-un and other senior officials were tantamount to a declaration. But Ri's explicit threat to shoot U.S. warplanes out of the sky was telling. Not only did it open up frightening new possibilities for a miscalculation that leads to wider conflict, it also exposed a visceral fear of U.S. air bombardment, greater, perhaps, than the fear of nuclear annihilation. In a show of force last weekend, U.S. B-1B Lancer bombers from Andersen Air Force Base on Guam, along with F-15C Eagle fighter escorts from the southern Japanese island of Okinawa, flew off the east coast of North Korea. U.S. bombers have carried out similar flights before. B-1B planes flew in the region as recently as last month. But the Pentagon was at pains to remind Pyongyang that this was the furthest north of the demilitarized zone separating the two Koreas that any U.S. fighter or bomber has flown this century. It did not take North Korea long to respond. On Monday, South Korea's Yonhap news agency reported that the regime had started moving planes and boosting defenses on its east coast following the B-1B sorties. While the bombers are no longer part of the U.S. nuclear force, they can be loaded with large numbers of conventional weapons, a capability that will not have been lost on North Koreans old enough to remember the Korean War. North Korea started the conflict when it sent almost 250,000 of its soldiers across the 38th parallel and into the south at dawn on the 25th of June 1950. But, as Bruce Cummings notes in his book The Korean War, A History, what hardly any Americans know or remember, however, is that we carpet-bombed the North for 3 years with next to no concern for civilian casualties. Blaine Harden, author of The Great Leader and The Fighter Pilot, said North Korean targets were mostly easy pickings for U.S. B-29S bombers that faced little or no opposition from the ground. In an op-ed for The Washington Post, Harden cited Dean Rusk, a supporter of the war who went on to become Secretary of State in the 1960s, as saying that the U.S. had bombed everything that moved in North Korea, every brick standing on top of another. Curtis LeMay, head of the U.S. Air Force Strategic Air Command during the conflict, would later boast that the U.S. bombing campaign killed about 20% of the population. "We went over there and fought the war and eventually burned down every town in North Korea," he said. Cummings said that the public intent was to erode enemy morale and end the war sooner, but the interior intent was to destroy Korean society down to the individual constituent. According to U.S. Air Force estimates, the bombings caused more damage to North Korea's urban centers than that seen in Germany or Japan during the Second World War, with the U.S. dumping 635,000 tons of bombs on Korea compared with 503,000 tons during the entire Pacific War. It is clear that for the North Korean regime and its military-first ideology, the devastation wrought by the Korean War looms large in the memory and mythology. Daryl Kimball, executive director of the Arms Control Association in Washington, despite the White House's dismissal of Ri's war declaration claim as absurd, his reference to U.S. bombers betrays North Korean fears of a preemptive strike, and of what demonstrations of air power may preface for Kim's leadership. The B-1B flights are a fairly regular feature of U.S. signaling to our allies that we stand ready to come to their defense, Kimball Gill added, but they are also seen as a threat by North Korea's military leaders because they would very likely be part of a first wave of retaliation in a conflict, or part of a decapitation strike on leadership targets.